Welcome back to the Age of the Renaissance. In this lecture, we continue our exploration into the profound thoughts and ideas that shaped this remarkable period. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanistic thinking, sparked a revolution in political thought and philosophy. This movement encouraged individuals to think independently and aspire to become enlightened and responsible citizens, fundamentally transforming the political landscape of the time. This shift is vividly exemplified in the works of prominent thinkers such as the Englishman Thomas More, the Italian Niccolò Machiavelli, and the Frenchman Claude de Seyssel. Their contributions introduced groundbreaking perspectives on governance, morality, and the role of the state, leaving an indelible mark on political theory. Around the mid-15th century, following a prolonged period of political turmoil, both the church and secular rulers began to reclaim their former grandeur and authority. This resurgence created fertile ground for the emergence of innovative ideas that challenged and redefined existing power structures. During the Middle Ages, the prevailing view of rulership was often unquestioned and absolute. However, many contemporary philosophers of the Renaissance era began to critique and distance themselves from these traditional notions. Among them was Marsilius of Padua, who asserted that the primary duty of a ruler was to serve society diligently and prioritize the well-being and prosperity of its citizens above all else. These revolutionary ideas not only reconfigured political thought, but also laid the foundations for modern concepts of democracy, governance, and civic responsibility. The Renaissance, therefore, was not just a revival of art and culture, but also a pivotal period that reimagined the principles and practices of political life. While many shared a common view of rulership during the Renaissance, it was Niccolò Machiavelli's far more radical perspective on leadership that resonated powerfully with both his contemporaries and generations to come. Machiavelli's fame stems largely from his seminal work, The Prince, in which he boldly argued for a new kind of ruler, one who was not bound by conventional notions of justice or injustice, but was instead defined by his skill in achieving his goals. In The Prince, Machiavelli poses one of the most provocative questions in political philosophy, and I quote from chapter 17, "And here comes in the question whether it is better to be loved rather than feared or feared rather than loved. It might perhaps be answered that we should wish to be both, but since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved." However, Machiavelli also cautions that while it is advantageous for a prince to be feared, he must avoid being hated, for it is possible to instill fear without inciting hatred. This nuanced approach became the foundation of what is now known as Machiavellianism, a term synonymous with a political strategy where the ends justify the means. In essence, Machiavelli argued that it was not sufficient, nor even desirable, for a ruler to be merely good or well-liked. Far more crucial was the ability to command fear and maintain power. This was the core of his revolutionary thinking, a philosophy that has since become a cornerstone of political realism. However, not everyone embraced Machiavelli's radical ideas. Among his most vocal critics were the Englishman Thomas More and the Dutch scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, who both vehemently opposed Machiavelli's philosophy, viewing it as profoundly amoral. Despite their objections, Machiavelli's influence grew, albeit more significantly in the centuries that followed than during his own lifetime. Thomas More, a philosopher deeply rooted in medieval thought and the moralizing tradition, envisioned the ruler not as a cunning strategist, but as a blessing and a vital necessity for any society. More's most famous literary work, Utopia, published in 1516, reflects these ideals. The title, which translates to Nowhere or No Place, describes a fictional society that stands in stark contrast to the flawed realities of contemporary Europe. In Utopia, More outlines an ideal society, free from the common weaknesses and vices of his time. The utopian community is built around the family unit, eschews private property and a money-driven economy, and offers a robust healthcare system. Every citizen is active and contributes to the common good, with the only distinctions among them being based on social rank. This vision has been interpreted in various ways over the years. Some have seen it as an early model of socialism, while others view it as a primitive society. Yet regardless of the interpretation, Utopia remains a remarkable work, a must-read for anyone interested in the intellectual currents of the Renaissance. Thomas More shared much of his philosophical outlook with his fellow humanist, Erasmus of Rotterdam. However, while More engaged with political thought, Erasmus focused his energies on religious reform. Erasmus was deeply concerned with the state of the Church, which he saw as corrupt and in desperate need of purification. His vision was not merely for superficial changes, but for a profound return to the principles and practices of the early Christian Church, a time he idealized as more authentic and spiritually pure. Erasmus advocated for reducing the overwhelming power of the papacy, which he believed had strayed far from its spiritual roots and had become entangled in worldly concerns. He sought a church that was less about hierarchy and more about faith, humility, and true Christian living. His calls for reform were not revolutionary in the sense of breaking away from the church, but rather were aimed at rejuvenating it from within, steering it back to the simplicity and sincerity of its origins. The corruption within the church reached new heights when Pope Julius II embarked on his grand vision of constructing a new St. Peter's Basilica. To fund this colossal project, the church began selling thousands of indulgences to Christians across Europe. This practice of indulgent sales met fierce opposition from an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther, who, in 1517, responded by publicly challenging the church with a bold set of criticisms known today as the 95 Theses. Luther's criticisms sparked an unexpected and rapid religious upheaval that we now refer to as the Reformation. The roots of this criticism were also nurtured by the humanists' deep interest in the literature of antiquity, which included the writings of the early church fathers and the study of Greek biblical texts. Through his rigorous study of the Bible, Luther became convinced that neither good works such as fasting, prayer, nor monetary gifts to the church could secure God's grace. The lavish lifestyle of the Pope and his court in Rome, funded by the contributions of Europe's faithful, further fueled Luther's discontent. The culmination of these grievances came when Christians, already burdened by various taxes, were asked to pay for indulgences to reduce their time in purgatory, an outrage that peaked with the plans for the new St. Peter's Basilica. Across Europe, the Pope's representatives, along with financiers such as the Fuggers of Augsburg, preached the virtues of indulgences. For a sum of money, Christians were told they could purchase a share in the Church's vast treasury of good deeds and thereby secure their release from the torments of purgatory. This widespread practice ultimately led Luther to nail his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, igniting a firestorm of religious debate. Initially, the Church excommunicated Martin Luther, but his ideas quickly gained a significant following. The growing movement led to fierce conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. Luther's critique of the Catholic Church spread rapidly across Germany and into France, the Netherlands, England, and Scandinavia, with Sweden becoming the first Protestant nation. This great schism had profound consequences for the Roman Catholic Church. Emperor Charles V, in particular, was determined to restore religious unity in Europe, especially within his own empire. Supported by the Pope, he initiated a series of reforms in the mid-16th century, aimed at addressing the Church's practices and finances. The Council of Trent was convened in northern Italy to deliberate on these issues. However, rather than yielding to Luther's demands or reforming the Church's institutions, the Council reaffirmed traditional doctrines, including the infallibility of the Pope. In response, the Church began to prepare for a confrontation with the Protestants, a period known as the Counter-Reformation. This was not just a time of doctrinal reaffirmation, but also of moral and institutional renewal. A key player in this movement was the Jesuit order, founded by the Spanish soldier Ignatius of Loyola. The church also intensified its efforts to root out heresy. Members of the Jesuit order underwent rigorous training that prepared them to influence society's upper echelons. Though ordained as priests, they were exempt from wearing clerical garb, allowing them to integrate more effectively into everyday life. The Jesuits became immensely influential across Europe and played a crucial role in leading many back to Catholicism. The Counter-Reformation did have a significant impact, but in the Swiss cities, the Protestant movement took on a distinct character under the leadership of John Calvin. Unlike Luther's church, which was governed by princes, the Calvinist church was ruled by the congregation. Calvin emphasized the absolute sovereignty of God, and in doing so, rejected Luther's teaching that salvation could be attained through faith alone. Instead, Calvin was a proponent of the doctrine of predestination, the belief that God had already chosen those who would be saved and enter paradise. One of the signs that a person was among the elect was their success in life. This aspect of Calvinism particularly resonated with the wealthy urban bourgeoisie, people who worked diligently and led simple lives. Calvinism quickly gained popularity in the Netherlands, Switzerland, England, Scotland, and France, where its principles of hard work, discipline, and frugality found fertile ground. In these regions, Calvinism became more than just a religious movement. It shaped the social and economic fabric of communities, aligning spiritual salvation with earthly success. This fusion of faith and daily life contributed to the rise of a new kind of Protestant ethic that would leave a lasting influence on European society. The Renaissance, as we've touched upon before, was not just a period of artistic and intellectual flourishing. It was also an era of remarkable discoveries that began in earnest during the 15th century. European explorers set sail into the unknown, revealing a world far larger and more diverse than anyone had imagined. These discoveries would have profound consequences, not just for Europe, but for the entire world. The roots of these explorations can actually be traced back to northern Italy. The economy of the wealthy city-states in this region was built on their control of trade in the Mediterranean. They imported and resold valuable and highly profitable spices and luxury goods from the East. Spices in particular were crucial in Europe at the time. With meat preserved in salt, the resulting blandness and occasional spoilage made spices essential, not only to enhance flavor, but also to mask any unpleasantness. However, the rise of the Ottoman Turks in the eastern Mediterranean disrupted this lucrative trade. The Turkish advance made the already costly Arab trade routes even more expensive due to the added burden of Turkish tolls. Initially, the Italians sought alternative routes to India, but eventually this mission was taken up by the Portuguese, who, having freed themselves from Muslim dominance, were well positioned along the Atlantic to explore new routes. Leading this charge was Prince Henry the Navigator, who lived from 1394 to 1460. His efforts culminated in a breakthrough in 1488 when Bartolomeu Dias successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa, opening the way for a sea route to the east. It wasn't until a decade later, in 1498, that Vasco da Gama completed the journey, crossing the Indian Ocean to reach India, breaking the Italian city-state's monopoly on the spice trade. While the Portuguese were pushing south, the Spaniards were preoccupied with their own struggles against the Moors. It was only after the fall of the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, the Kingdom of Granada in 1492, that the Spanish were able to turn their attention to exploration. That same year, the Genoese sailor Christopher Columbus persuaded the Spanish court to fund his daring plan to sail westward to reach India. After just over 2 months at sea, Columbus reached the Caribbean, which he believed to be the outskirts of India. This discovery sparked immediate tension between Spain and Portugal over rights to the newly discovered lands. The conflict was resolved in 1494 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the two powers, granting them exclusive rights to explore and claim territories within their respective spheres. Columbus's voyages were quickly followed by numerous expeditions westward. However, it soon became clear that Columbus had not found a new route to India, but rather a completely unknown continent. This vast land would come to be known as America, named not after Columbus, but after another Italian explorer, Amerigo Vespucci, who, somewhat mistakenly, was credited with recognizing the land as a new continent. In the following decades, exploration continued at a feverish pace. Between 1519 and 1522, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition finally succeeded in finding a route around the southern tip of South America to Asia, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Tragically, Magellan himself never completed the journey, as he was killed in the Philippines. The Americas, however, were not uninhabited lands waiting to be discovered. They were home to advanced civilizations such as the Incas and the Aztecs. But these cultures were quickly devastated by the brutal conquest and exploitation carried out by the Spaniards. The Spanish became extraordinarily wealthy, thanks in large part to the massive amounts of silver they extracted and shipped back to Europe. Meanwhile, the Portuguese continued to dominate the spice trade in the East, reaping immense profits from their overseas ventures. This concludes our introduction to the Age of the Renaissance, a period of extraordinary transformation and discovery. In the upcoming lessons, we will delve deeper into the origins of the Renaissance, examining the political, economic, and religious crises that shook Europe in the 14th century. These upheavals set the stage for the cultural rebirth that followed, giving rise to the remarkable era we've just begun to explore. If you find the Renaissance as captivating as we do, be sure to subscribe to the Academy of History and Culture. By subscribing, you'll stay updated with our latest lessons and continue your journey through one of history's most fascinating periods.